Hey everyone, got the spoilers here for M21 coming in. Blue. In practice, probably my favorite color. I do like green a lot, but I mean the reality is I like winning, so blue tends to be one of my favorite colors. If you were to take a look at the cards that I actually sleeve up, and we'll see if there's any spicy cards in here that might see play in Eternal, Commander, Pauper, your format of choice. Let's just jump right in. We got Baron, Talarian Archmage, a 3-mana 2/2 legendary creature, potential commander, and doesn't look super easy to abuse. Enters the battlefield, you can return a creature or planeswalker to its owner's hand, and then at the beginning of your end step, you can draw a card if a permanent's been put into your hand from the battlefield this turn. The delay on that trigger makes it pretty difficult to use in any type of combo deck. Feels like a value card, which you could potentially build around in some type of control shell, but there are likely better options, though it is cool to see Baron back. He was a pretty awesome character in the Magic lore, and it's fun to see him back on a Magic card. We've got Cancel, vanilla counterspell with 1 extra mana tacked on. Not really a fan of this card. I don't generally enjoy playing it. It's good enough to make the cut in some of the lower powered formats. I'd just rather have more powerful cards in my deck, so Counterspell is kind of the bottom of the barrel for me. From there, I just want to go up in power to things like Mana Drain, certainly not down to a 3-mana cancel. And if I were paying 3 mana, I probably want something with some more upside to it besides, literally no upside beside countering. Capture Sphere. At 4 mana, we've got an enchantment with flash. When it enters the battlefield, tap the creature, and it doesn't untap. Sleep style effect. This is often portrayed with cards kind of capturing something in ice. This is nothing new. 4 mana in flash, however, I think is probably more playable than many of these cards have been in the past. And this is a card that I expect will certainly be playable in Limited, and that is about it. Discontinuity, very interesting card. Ends the turn, so that effectively just wipes the stack, goes to the end step. So it's a type of counterspell. It also only costs 2 mana on your turn, 1 in a blue, so this could get rid of detrimental triggers. There's some interesting use to this card. I am actually kind of happy to see it. I don't know exactly how it'll fit in, if there'll be any constructed play. It certainly seems within the realm of possibilities, but that's an interesting card. Good printing. Enthralling Hold at 5 mana. You control enchanted creature, but you can't choose an untapped creature as you cast the spell. Stealing creatures is pretty great. The fact that you have to grab one of their attackers is a little bit of a tempo shift, but it's a solid card for Limited, potentially, and that's about it. Frantic Inventory at 2 mana, draw a card, then draw cards equal to the number of cards named Frantic Inventory in your graveyard. Note that it's not all graveyards. This is accumulated knowledge, but kind of made easier to use, so you don't get punished for being the first person to flinch and potentially get blown out in an unknown matchup where you didn't know you were facing down accumulated knowledge. Yeah, I could take or leave this printing. I like accumulated knowledge. I did really well in those mirrors. It was a very skill-intensive era, and we had deep analysis that we'd also play, so we could intuition for deep analysis first and just have an absolute barrel of card advantage back in the day in Vintage. Frost Breath, a reprint, tap up to 2 creatures. They don't untap during their next untap step. Solid removal from a tempo perspective. Of course, it doesn't actually get rid of the creature, so you probably need to get rid of the player before those untap in order for this type of effect to be worthwhile. Ghostly Pilferer. This is an interesting card. I like it. 2 mana for a 2/1. Whenever it becomes untapped, you can pay 2. If you do, you draw a card. And whenever an opponent casts a spell from anywhere other than their hand, you draw a card. You can also discard a card to make it so it can't be blocked. Interesting that it doesn't have flying, being a spirit, but it does have that unblockable element by discarding a card, which is not likely to be worth it very often unless you've got some type of discard matters theme. But it's a fun card, and people may be able to build around that for some type of standard decks. Historian of Zafir, when it attacks, if you control a Teferi Planeswalker, you draw a card. 3/3 for 4 that draws a card is a interesting printing. I believe from the collector number, this may be from the Planeswalker decks, so that probably doesn't have much use. It could definitely, if you had a Teferi in limited, I mean, that's just Christmas land. Drawing cards with your 3/3 Ophidians is pretty solid, but this is likely just going to be for casual tables. Jeskai Elder, another reprint, 2 mana prowess creature. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you may loot, draw a card, then discard a card. Not super impressive. Prowess, tough to make really good in limited. In constructed formats, prowess is incredibly potent, but this doesn't really have the stats to be constructed playable, and prowess is not really good for limited for the most part. A 1/2. I mean, it's not like you're going to be chaining spells together in your draft deck. Keen Glidemaster, 2 mana for a 2/1, pay 2 and a blue. Target creature gains flying until end of turn. Solid breakthrough card potentially for limited. That'll depend on how much pinging there is in the format, if that one backside ends up being a big liability or not. But historically, 2 power creatures for 2 mana with some type of upside are often a welcome addition to aggressive decks in limited. A 3 mana Library Larcenist here. Whenever it attacks, draw a card. I'd love to see some bigger stats on this. I mean, it is a 1/3, wouldn't be the end of the world. But yeah, as it stands, this is not likely to survive combat. I do enjoy the idea that you don't know if you've got a combat trick before attacking. I mean, even if you're really good at reading people, you don't necessarily know whether or not it was a good attack, because they could just draw a pump spell or something that would completely change the dynamic. So a fun card, but not really going to see too much play at that mana cost. Lofty Denial. There's a bunch of counter spells here that I was excited to review. Counter target spell, unless its controller pays 1. If you control a creature with flying, then they have to pay 4. And I mean, that's interesting. I don't know that there's going to be any decks that are going to be happy to run it. It's essentially a better mana leak when things work, and that's not going to be all the time. So perhaps there'll be some type of standard deck that can make use of this, but for older formats, there's so many good counter spells. This one's not going to be making the cut. Miscast, however, could potentially make the cut in some circumstances. So counter target instant or sorcery unless its controller pays 3. This directly competes with Flusterstorm. Now with Flusterstorm, if they've only played 1 spell and you play Flusterstorm, they've got to pay 2. So this is really only good in like that exact situation. Any other time, Flusterstorm would be way better, as you'd be able to, like if they play a spell or you played a spell, now Storm is 3, they still have to pay 3. The major difference being Miscast is easier to counter than 3 separate copies of Flusterstorm. So it's possible in formats where Flusterstorm is not viable or legal, that Miscast will see a bunch of play as a specific sideboard counter spell. But in terms of formats where Flusterstorm is legal, that's a pretty narrow window. So the metagame would have to be kind of line up perfectly for this to be a reasonable choice over Flusterstorm. Mistral Singer, flying, prowess, 2/2 for 3. This is a type of card that I'd actually enjoy a lot in limited. 3 mana for a 2/2 flyer is totally acceptable, and the fact that prowess can create some really ugly situations even better. If they are trying to block with a 2/2 in the air, you can potentially use a removal spell on a separate creature and get a 2 for 1. This is the type of card that I feel great about sleeving up, especially in sealed. Mystic Skyfish. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, it gains flying until end of turn. A 3 mana, 3/1 potential flyer if you've got some real smooth deck building. Not really super exciting there. More than likely it's going to trade down, which feels pretty terrible. You trading a 3 mana creature for a 2 mana creature, or worse. Not really how you win in limited. Opt. What can I say about Opt that hasn't been said already? This card sees a ton of play, and just another reprint. Just Apparently Wizards is totally fine with this card being in standard, giving us card selection. There is a line in terms of how good cantrips can be, and Opt is on the other side of that line, totally safe, it would seem. Pursued Whale has awesome flavor. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent creates a 1/1 red pirate token with this creature can't block, and creatures you control attack each combat if able, basically making all of their creatures go crazy, and they have to swing every turn. Just a lot of fun. Also, spells your opponent cast that target Pursued Whale costs 3 more, making it a little bit difficult. Didn't go ahead and give it hexproof. They just made it hard to actually take down this whale. And it's a fun card for Commander. That's about it at 8 mana. In terms of limited, I mean, I guess that's probably pretty good in limited, making it so creatures you control attack each combat if able while you've got an 8/8 blocker. That's probably a disaster for many decks. However, if they're just beating you down in the air anyways, it's not really going to help you out too much. So interesting card. I enjoy the design. I enjoy the flavor. And it's at least a consideration if you open it in your pool, whether or not playing a 7 mana card is going to be worthwhile. Reign of Revelation. Draw 3, then discard a card. Just 1 more mana than being incredibly good. At instant speed, we've seen Thirst for Knowledge be a literal vintage playable card. That's a ton of card advantage, drawing 3 and discarding a card in a deck that can utilize the discarded card, either bringing it back from the graveyard or having some type of triggers off of discarding. There's a lot of power there, but at 4 mana, there's just not much to say. Could possibly be playable in your sealed pool, as you'd be able to filter through, discard an extra land, and reload, but that is about it. Read the Tides. At 6 mana sorcery, we're either drawing 3 cards or returning 2 target creatures to their owner's hand. Bouncing 2 creatures is a powerful effect, but sorcery speed on this one makes it pretty tough. They've printed much better bounce in recent years that have been complete game winners, and this may still win you games in limited, and the draw 3 for 6 is an awful lot. I'd much rather have it cost 2 less mana and be instant speed like the previous card than commit the extra 2 mana just to keep the card and have to waste an entire turn with the shields down. Rewind. Speaking of keeping the shields up, Rewind, a classic counterspell from back in Urza's Saga. Counter target spell and untap up to 4 lands. Those 4 lands in limited typically just going to be basic, so you can get a little bit of mana fixing potentially. But for the most part, the way to think about this is a free counterspell versus defenseless deck. So if they don't have counterspells and you play Rewind, it essentially costs 0, assuming that Rewind's going to untap, and you're going to be able to move forward from there with the remaining mana. Riddle Form, a 2 mana enchantment. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you can have it become a 3/3 Sphinx creature with flying in addition to its other types until end of turn, and you can scry for 2 and a blue. It's an interesting card. There's a lot that really needs to go into it. It probably would have felt a lot better if there was a way of triggering this without playing a non-creature spell, but the scrying does kind of let you dig towards your instants and sorceries, etc. In limited, you're typically going to need a ton of creatures in your deck. You're not going to have nearly as many non-creature spells, so this one's probably going to be a trap in limited, though 3/3 flyers for 2 when they work perfectly would certainly get most decks out of there in a hurry. Roaming Ghostlight, a 5 mana 3/2 with flying. When it enters the battlefield, you can return a target non-spirit creature to its owner's hand. This is a very dangerous card in limited. 3/2 flyer for 5 with a bounce spell tacked onto it. So 5 mana, obviously more than you want to spend on a 3/2 flyer, though there are plenty of formats where we've held our nose and spent that mana for that level of power on an evasive body. The fact that it returns a non-spirit creature to its owner's hand is a huge tempo swing, and that makes it one of the cards I'd be on the lookout for in draft for this M21 set. Rookie Mistake. Until end of turn, target creature gets +0/+2 and another gets -2/-0. This type of card can make a mess out of combat, preserving one of your creatures and preventing a trade on the other side. A lot of the time these cards feel like they should end up being 2-for-1s, and they don't necessarily end up doing that. So we'll see how good this actually ends up being in Limited. There's a black-blue card, something Agony I think it is, from Shards of Alara, that always looked like it was going to be an easy 2-for-1, and it just never was. It was always just -0/-3 to a creature. So this one I suspect probably isn't going to be great, but at 1 mana, Combat Trick could definitely catch some people. Rousing Reed at 3 mana, enchant creature. When Rousing Reed enters the battlefield, draw 2 cards, then discard a card. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has flying. So essentially this is going to be replacing itself while also digging, which makes it an interesting card. The +1/+1 and flying, not inconsequential, particularly in a blue-green build, tossing this on a giant creature, giving it wings, and also kind of looting. It's an interesting card. It's an enchantment that I'd actually consider playing, which is a pretty high bar. Usually I shy away from enchantments in Limited, but if you can time this right, not get blown out by removal, then this could be a real game-changing card. Sanctum of Calm Waters. At the beginning of your pre-combat main, you can draw X cards, where X is the number of shrines you control. If you do, discard a card. So when this is out at 4 mana, you're just looting each time. If you get multiple shrines, you actually start netting card advantage. I don't really know where these shrines are going to be used. It doesn't feel like they're good enough for Constructed. It doesn't look like they're fun enough for casual play. I guess we'll see. Maybe there'll be more shrines in other sets. I don't know. It feels like a kind of pre-made Voltron idea that they want you to play with, which I don't know. I don't know if people are going to buy it. Let me know what you think about this one in the comments. The Sanctums, are you excited to play, or does it just feel forced to you? See the Truth. This is an incredibly interesting card. It's got Legacy players excited. Snapcaster Mage, eyeball in this one. Anytime that you're playing this from not your hand, it's 2 mana, draw 3, and those are tough to come by. So we have things like Standstill, which are very conditional in Legacy. This card, you can cascade into it with anything. Shardless Agent, the most common thing that people are thinking. You can Snapcaster it. Dreadhorde Arcanist can get it if it has a boost to its power. Bolus's Citadel, casting off the top of the library. Anything that lets you cast off the top of the library, for that matter. Anything that gives it flashback. People are just brewing and trying to figure out what they want to do with this card, because the power level is right there at 2 mana. It is very attractive to try and figure out a way to make this work. And the fact that the first time you play it, you're putting it into your graveyard, so you're getting a card out of it, and then 3 more when you flash it back. That's a heck of a lot of cards. It is a card game, so cards tend to be a good thing. Shacklegeist can only block creatures with flying. You can tap 2 untapped spirits you control to tap target creature you don't control. This card looks brutal. Probably, this feels like Constructed playable. The ability to tap down target creature you don't control with your flyers, things like Lingering Souls. This could be a mess for fair decks trying to turn creatures sideways for an honest day's work. You can just completely mess up their plans with no mana investment in terms of tying up their board. And the fact that it's a 2/2 flyer for 2, really, I think this card is pushed, and I think Spirits are going to be happy to try and make this guy work. Really interesting printing, and yeah, just tapping down their guys is really interesting. Opposition is a strategy that was very difficult to deal with. Of course, that could go off to the mana base too. Major difference, don't get me wrong, but the fact that this can take out their creatures without a mana investment repeatedly is pretty sweet. Shipwreck Douser, another prowess creature, this one for 5 mana. When it enters the battlefield, you can return an instant or sorcery from your graveyard to your hand. At uncommon, I don't really know where this card would see play. It feels like the type of thing that could have seen play in Pauper. They've got 4 mana cards that return instants or sorceries. Maybe we'd be happy to have the Prowess Body and a 3/3 on top of that. But as it is, I think there's just cheaper ways of doing this if you want to get the cards back. And if you're looking to get aggressive, 5 mana 3/3s aren't really the best way to go. I think in limited, buying back your removal spells could be really powerful, and the body is actually pretty good on top of that. So I'd say overall, limited, really good card. Prowess there adds a little bit of danger, makes it interesting. Obviously not as good as Prowess and Constructed, but you can have that threat of potentially making it a 4/4 and really complicating combat. Spiked Megalodon. We've been seeing Sharks and Ikoria, all sorts of crazy monsters. They continue here. A 7 mana hexproof 5/7. Whenever it attacks, you get to scry 1. I don't really know where this can fit in. I saw people getting excited about it. I'm not sure that I can really get on board at all. People think it could see play in something like a control shell. I think there's better options, even if you're trying to exhume this. I mean, there's cycling creatures that you can draw a card when you cycle and then exhume them, and then you're ahead on card advantage. The hexproof is pretty nice, but there's really not that many things that you'd target that with in Pauper. I mean, that's a huge backside. It is a 5/7, which lords over the board, but it's not bigger than the Eldrazi, which tend to see play in other Reanimator strategies. So I don't know where this could possibly see play. It's something that Pauper players were interested in, but I think ultimately probably won't make the cut. But that's something to look for anytime that there's a common creature that's just big, could possibly see play in Pauper, which is really a brewer's paradise anyways. So who's to tell you that you can't play this in Pauper? Stormwing Entity, a 5 mana 3/3. Some of the time, it costs 2 and a blue less if you've cast an instant or sorcery this turn, which essentially, you're paying 2 mana for it if you've Manamorphosed or something before this. Later on in the game, if you're brainstorming or pondering some type of opt effect. I wouldn't be surprised if this sees play in Standard. A 3/3 flyer for 2 can probably come down on the second turn or the third turn after a opt or similar card, and scrying 2 immediately impacts the board. So even if they do clear it out, you still have the value from the scry. I think this is probably going to see some play in Standard. Sublime Epiphany, just a wall of text, reminds me a lot of Cryptic Command, but you get to choose 1 or more on this. You can do pretty much whatever you want for 6 mana, which honestly, if you're just able to dunk on your opponent by casting 6 mana spells uncontested, you probably should be able to do whatever you want. That's an awful lot of mana to be spending, and I mean, at least the create a token that's a copy of target creature you control gives this some real teeth. It's not all just reactive. I mean, Commander, sure, drawing a card and making a creature and doing a bunch of other stuff, very spicy, but outside of Commander, tough to imagine being able to reliably resolve a 6 mana spell. Teferi, Master of Time, might be the most talked about Planeswalker in this set. You can activate his loyalty abilities anytime, and that just means you're going to be doing it on each player's turn, making him interesting for Constructed and formats like Commander that are multiplayer. Plussing him on a big enough table is an absolute nightmare. If you get this guy down early due to acceleration on a big enough table, you're going to be getting to extra turns right away. And the phasing out is a nice nod to Magic's history, but really it's about ramping him up and taking extra turns. I think Commander players are probably going to hate this guy, and I think that's what they were going for. Teferi's Ageless Insight. If you draw a card, except the first one you draw on each of your turns, instead draw 2 cards. A enchantment that can potentially turbocharge cards like Opt, Brainstorm. There's all sorts of casual implications for this card, but at 4 mana as a kind of setup to additional card drawing, definitely just seems like it'll be for the casual tables. Teferi's Protege, a 2/3 for 3, not the best stats. Paying 2 mana to loot, not necessarily the type of effect you actually want to pay mana for. So we'll see. It could be good in limited. Looting can be very, very good in limited. Depends on if there's any additional synergy besides just discarding those excess lands and making sure you never flood out. But like I said, often, we prefer not to have to spend as much mana to loot, as you're hopefully discarding the card and then playing something in that turn. 2 mana really cuts down on the limits of what's possible there. Teferi's Tutelage. When it enters the battlefield, you draw and discard, and then whenever you draw a card, target opponent mills 2. At uncommon, this is a dangerous card. If you get a few of these in limited, I mean, you could definitely be milling out your opponent. It sets the clock. You have to have a defensive deck, but mill kind of lives and dies by the commons and uncommons. That strategy needs a lot of support in order to come together. But this is an instance where this one card could technically be enough to beat your opponent as long as you survive. Every turn, they're going to be drawing a card and milling 2. And, I mean, it's going to go pretty quick. You're talking like 13 turns at most. They drew 7. They got 33, so that's 11 turns that way. So, yeah, it's an interesting printing. I like it. I love the fact that it says mill, as people have commented before. Mill is something that we've used to describe taking 2 cards off the top of your library, or taking any cards off the top of your library. It goes back to Millstone, a card from Antiquities. And this is definitely an alternate win condition. I could see it being good enough for Standard as well, though I'm not sure that I'd hope for that, as mill strategies are notoriously hated by casual players. They really hate getting milled out. They want to fight with creatures, and if you don't do that, you're a coward. Teferi's Wavecaster, a 3/3 for 5. When it enters the battlefield, you can search your library or graveyard for a card named Teferi Timeless Voyager, reveal it, and add it to your hand. Those Planeswalker decks give you the ability to tutor up your Planeswalker of choice in those decks, and a 3/3 with Flash can be tricky. I mean, you can definitely get out there and get some value as well, hopefully killing a smaller creature. Worst case, maybe trading with a larger, a creature with a 7/3 stats, something along those lines, getting a little bit of value out of the surprise blocker, while also replacing itself with one of the more powerful cards in your deck. And there is the Teferi Timeless Voyager. +1 to draw a card, -3 to put a creature on top of its owner's library, and the -8 target creature opponent control. Each creature target opponent controls phases out until your next turn. They can't phase in. So really clearing the way, putting creatures on top of the owner's library, a very frustrating thing for casual players. The thing that they're looking forward to is drawing a new card, and you're just making it so they draw the same card over again. There are strategies like that in Pauper, which are very common. Chittering Rats is one of those cards that puts a card from your hand on top of the library. I've rarely seen a person more demoralized when they know exactly what's going to happen on their turn before it even starts. We love randomness in Magic, and this gets rid of that randomness for that one turn, and to the degree that it does that is probably the degree that your opponent's not having any fun. So griefers will, I'm sure, enjoy this card. +1 to draw a card gives this guy a bunch of loyalty, but ultimately it's 6 mana. This is mostly just going to be for casual play. Those Planeswalker decks are a great way to learn the game, and I expect that's likely where this will stay. Tide Skimmer at 4 mana, a 2/3. Whenever you attack with 2 or more creatures you control with flying, you draw a card. That is a very, very powerful effect in a deck full of cheap flyers. Coming down on turn 4, it is 2 or more creatures with flying, so he does not have to be one of them. So keep in mind, if you have a turn 2 and turn 3 flyer, and you jam this guy in turn 4, you're recouping the card at combat. So depending on how inexpensive the flyers are on your deck, this guy could just create an avalanche of card advantage and get your opponent out of there in a hurry. Talarian Kraken, beautiful art, absolutely love it. Very flavorful. Whenever you draw a card, you may pay 1. If you do, you may tap or untap target creature. All sorts of different shenanigans that can happen there. Twiddling, tapping down your opponent's creatures. This card could be an absolute nightmare to play against. A huge body and the ability to disrupt your opponent's creatures, or even just have a surprise blocker. This one's a fun one. Tome Anima. Tome Anima can't be blocked as long as you've drawn 2 or more cards this turn. A 3/3 for 4, potentially unblockable. The amount of cantripping you're able to do, determining whether or not this card is just overcosted or just a really good finisher. Yeah, I mean, it's a build-around card in Limited, and that's probably the extent of this one. Unsubstantiate, really interesting card. Would not be surprised to see this seeing play in Standard, where the counter spells are not super powerful. It returns a spell or creature to its owner's hand, so really depends on the mana that they're investing into their spells. If Standard's at a point where people are trying to resolve 5 and 6 mana spells, then something like this is just frustrating, bouncing it back to their hand. You can also clear the board with it. An interesting card. In the past, cards like this would draw a card, and that is offset by the fact that it can also return a creature. So Remand, incredibly good. That was a play set in Standard while it was there. And this, on the other hand, doesn't draw a card, but it can bounce that creature off the board. Definitely not as good as Remand, but could see play in Constructed. It would not shock me. Vodalian Arcanist can tap to add a colorless mana, and you can spend this mana only to cast an instant or sorcery. A Merfolk Wizard, I'd imagine this will see play in Azami Commander decks, and that's about it. Tapping for mana in blue is a coveted ability. There's a handful of cards that do that. They're generally playable in Commander, as blue is... that's one of the deficiencies in blue, is just not having as much mana acceleration as some of the other colors. Being able to go mono blue and have acceleration is an interesting prospect. So I would certainly play this in Azami, being a wizard, and being able to tap for either a card when she's out or a mana to play some instants or sorceries. Waker of Waves. Creatures your opponent control get -1/-0. This 7 mana 7/7 also has an activated ability of 1 in the blue. Discard it to look at your top 2 cards of your library and put one of them into your hand and the other into your graveyard. This card, if it was common, would definitely be a consideration for Pauper, as you'd be able to discard it and then exhume it back while also kind of digging through your library. Instead, at uncommon, I don't really know where this has a home. It's got that mini Elish Norn effect on it, which would have been really cool for Pauper as well. But as it is, I think this one just, ends up being fine for Limited. And I mean, if you can bring things back, I'm looking forward to seeing the black cards. If there's a way of discarding this guy and then animate dead, I mean, that would be the spice. Wall of Runes. Is this the last card? I hope not, because this is a weak note to go down on. When it enters the battlefield, scry 1. Best thing you can really do with this is some type of flickering, but there's better things to flicker. 0/4 walls have never won a game of Magic. They cannot attack, and it is very rare that they're even part of a good strategy. If you love walls, I'm sorry. I'm just being honest with you. Not saying you can't have fun with it. I'm just saying if you're not winning, there might be a reason why. Wishcoin Crab, a 2/5 for 4. It's a body with a big backside. You might hold your nose and play this as one of your later cards in draft. Looks like blue had a bunch of good flyers, so being able to hold down the fort on the ground may not be the worst thing in the world. And that brings us back around to Baron. So that was all the blue cards from this set. I hope you're enjoying these. If you do, let me know in the comments, and we'll see you with the next color.